obviously the headline story of this week was the horror of the terrorist attack in Brussels. And here to help us process that now is Jim Arkedis. And before I introduce Jim, I just want to say that obviously we're all struggling with how to react swiftly and decisively to this tragedy, how to prevent future tragedies, but how to do so in a way that is both humane and effective, that keeps people safe while reflecting the best in our values. And so we've asked Jim to come on the show and think through that process with us. Jim is a fellow at the Truman National Security Project. He is president of Arkedis Strategies, a strategic communications and political consulting firm, and he is the president of 4D PAC, a multi-candidate hard money political action committee that seeks out progressive national security candidates for Congress and Senate. So, Jim, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, absolutely. And I guess, in my introduction, I kind of set up what I wanted to talk to you about. We're all shocked and horrified. We've seen this too many times now, these terrorist attacks. But let's start with this. What would be a smart and humane progressive response to these attacks?
Well, the way I like to frame anything that we do in foreign policy, and look, I was a counterterrorism analyst at the Department of Defense for about 5 years, so I've seen a lot of the stuff on the front lines dating back to the days just after 9/11. The way I like to frame anything that the United States does in foreign policy is essentially our values are our interests. Right? Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is that the things that we have and that we hold dear in this country, equality of opportunity, freedom of expression, the opportunity to become economically prosperous, those should form the bedrock of everything we do abroad. And so when we're talking about ISIS or Al-Qaeda or anything else that has to do, any terrorist groups, we have to, first of all, acknowledge that the places they inhabit and the circumstances that allow them to grow strength are places that don't have these things, right? They are territories that they are allowed to grow and prosper because these absolutist, perverse interpretations of Islam permit them to deny people rights and education and democratic institutions and things like that. And so that's very important. Now, as progressives, I think it's very important to say, particularly for voters in swing districts, when we communicate about this, and this is not just a political calculation, but it's also the truth. We have to be able to talk very, very succinctly about the fact that ISIS is a thuggish group of killers, and we have to be able to use our military to wipe them off the face of the earth. ISIS is a horrible group of people who justify our retaliation with force. That is first and foremost. And so now we have to be much more careful about how we use force, because you hear a candidate like Ted Cruz talking about, we're just going to go in and carpet bomb them, which of course is not humane at all. Because you subject innocent civilians to the same kind of indiscriminate military action that you shouldn't be able to when you're using a highly targeted strategy. But we have to be able to say it is okay in these circumstances to use our military. But we also have to acknowledge, in terms of what we're doing over the long term, that this is a sustained issue. This is not going away anytime soon. And if we are to really address the root of the problem for how we eventually, quote unquote, solve terrorism, we have to acknowledge that the United States, should be involved. We should be able to encourage these societies to build democratic institutions, to build educational institutions, allow people to gain access to education, contribute economic assistance to make sure that these places do get the opportunity to prosper. Now, a lot of progressives recoil from that formulation because, basically, because we did the wrong thing in Iraq, means to some people that we shouldn't do anything anywhere else, and that maybe it's just easier to stay home. I push back very hard about that, against that notion, because while we have this intense reaction to what George Bush did in Iraq, which was done, of course, under the false pretenses of looking for weapons of mass destruction, but also this idea that Iraq was going to turn into a Jeffersonian democracy overnight, of course, is much more difficult in practice. And
right.
So I say that standing up for democracy and allowing people the ability to choose their leaders is something very important, and that just because George Bush went about doing that the wrong way does not mean that that's a bad thing. Because
right. Let me just jump in for a second, Jim Arkedis. Well, one of the things I guess I would ask you is, I think you're saying several things. I think one of them is in essence an extension of, if I'm understanding you correctly, of what John F. Kennedy said 50 years ago, 60 years ago, that those who make peaceful evolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable, that if people are forced to live in unjust, undemocratic, impoverished societies, they will turn to violence and extremism. I guess the challenge comes in, and I hear you, you're also saying we should be willing to use force, and that but I think in practice, targeted force, the concern that a lot of people have, obviously, I think most of us would agree that the idea of carpet bombing entire populations is obscene and counterproductive. But in practice, hasn't our targeted warfare actually turned out to be, if you think of drones, for example, a little bit indiscriminate and perhaps counterproductive as well?
It certainly can be on occasion. I mean, we see stories all the time about the United States military doing a drone strike here or there that is hits a civilian area and causes civilian casualties. Like, of course, and that's something that we should be mindful. And I think that the Obama administration has been a little bit too cavalier in terms of the nature of drone strikes. There are times and places, certainly, that we can and should use them to take out people who would do us harm. But we have to make sure that the checks and balances that are in place to make sure that the targets are vetted and in the places that they should be and are not protected by civilians are equally as strong. And that's where occasionally we've fallen down.
Yeah, and I would argue also that you can't protect international law by violating international law. So we have to be sure we're obeying international law and domestic law when we do that. That would be my position. I don't know if you agree, but...
Well, no, basically, and also I want to go back to your earlier. Of course, we should obey international law, like that. That's without question. However, there are certainly times when people are plotting to do things that would harm and kill Americans, and in those extraordinary circumstances, it is okay to use force in order to stop them. Now. To your point about the JFK quote, I think it's really important to take a step back and talk about, America's entire strategy across the Middle East and North Africa for, basically since the end of the World War, end of the Second World War, which was, if you are a dictator in any country across the region, the United States will support you and will sell you weapons so long as you keep the peace in your country, and will sort of turn a blind eye as you don't allow people to go to the ballot box, you repress minority rights, that sort of thing. But the number one is just keep things stable throughout the region. And starting, of course, with September 11th, but then, with the Arab Spring in 2011, I don't think that anybody would be able to argue that over the long term has proven to be a constructive long-term Middle East policy. And just exactly to the JFK quote, that's where we are. And so this is why, in my view, it's very important for the United States to be engaged and to continue to nudge on the margins where possible all of these countries to a measured evolution towards democracy.
Well, wouldn't that, I first of all, I agree with you 100%, Jim Arkedis, but secondly, wouldn't that require a significant shift in our Middle East policy? We seem to be very reliant on the Saudis, who do not have a democracy, and some of the other states in the Middle East that do not have a democracy. Wouldn't we have, we're both relying on and attempting to overthrow Assad at the same time, which seems to me you have to pick one of those things, and do one first and maybe the second, but aren't you really calling, and by the way, this is not a criticism, but it is a question, aren't you calling for a significant shift in our Middle East policy?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I don't think that anybody could say that what we've done for the last 7 decades, and presidents of both administrations have basically followed this policy. I don't think that anybody could say that it's been terribly productive over the long term. And so, take Saudi Arabia, which is a difficult ally to say the least, and I'm being diplomatic there.
Right.
We do think, like the United States misses opportunities all the time to even nudge totalitarian states towards the direction of democracy. And I actually thought that President Obama's speech in Havana the other day was excellent. But Cuba has been a historic adversary, and so going in and saying that democracy is good and look at the healthy debate we have in our country and you should do that is one thing. It's very easy. It's much more difficult for the Obama administration to go into Saudi Arabia and say the same thing because they are ostensibly our ally.
Right, and Cuba doesn't have oil.
Right, well, true. And I thought one of the biggest missed opportunities of the Obama administration is the women's drive movement in Saudi Arabia, where John Kerry went to Saudi Arabia and he conducted a press conference next to the king, and he was asked a question about women being able to drive in Saudi Arabia, and he demurred, and his answer was along the lines of, "Well, we allow the Saudis to make their own answers and policies and laws about these issues," and that's the wrong answer. The answer is, in the United States, we believe in equality, and we think that everybody should be able to drive.
Right, and great point. We're talking with Jim Arkedis, who's a fellow at the Truman National Security Project and president of Arkedis Strategies. And Jim, by the way, parenthetically, this, but I don't think some of our listeners won't. Saudi Arabia is the only Muslim country that I know of that does not allow women to drive, and I think that by saying that, the Secretary of State would have enhanced our reputation and what Gary Hart, I think, used to call the fourth power, which is the power of just what you described earlier, our reputation for democracy and justice and those sorts of things.
Absolutely. And so when you asked the question a minute ago about a fundamental shift in our Middle East strategy, I refer to what I said at the very opening, like our point of departure for our entire foreign policy should be focused on our values, and our values as human rights. And so we should be allied to the founding values of our country and not personalities, essentially, who can keep the peace and who have been friendly to us, and yet with whom we are very, very hesitant to use the levers, our strategic levers of power against them. And if you look at a country like Egypt, of course, Hosni Mubarak fell, in response to revolution in the streets. Morsi was elected subsequently, and of course there were many, many problems with Morsi's presidency, but he was democratically elected. And then when there were additional protests, and he eventually fell, it's almost like the Western world breathed a sigh of relief. That now El-Sisi is in power, and he's a military strongman, and he's the type of person we know we can do business with. Democracy and the evolution of democracy is over the long term and a very messy process. And sometimes, in the short to medium term, the people who might immediately be our allies don't win all the time.
Right.
And we have to be prepared to accept that, but still use our strategic leverage as the United States, as the most wealthy country in the world, the most generous country in the world, but also the country with the biggest military, to prod and nudge those regimes that are not automatically friendly to us in the direction of at least holding up the democratic institutions over the long term.
And I think that's absolutely right. And the fact of the situation is, our generals know the Egyptian generals and so on and so on. There are also channels of influence that come along with being the military power we are. And those channels can be used to support or undermine the democratic process. I'm going to do something really unfair to you now, Jim Arkedis, but I'm going to allow you to say it's unfair. We got about a minute and a half left, and I wanted to ask you, okay, so here we are. What do we do about ISIS? Totally. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's incredibly unfair. But,
sorry.
No, that's quite all right. In a first instance, as I said earlier, I think it is imperative that we use the military. Progressives are quite often uncomfortable saying this, but the fact of the matter is that between airstrikes and uses of special forces and things like that to cut off supply lines, separate ISIS bases of power in Syria and in Iraq. That's, in a first instance, absolutely necessary. There was a good article in the Washington Post about how it was just in the Washington Post this morning, despite horrific incidents like we've had in Brussels, we are making significant progress against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And so that's a good thing.
Right.
But in the long term, it's important to pivot to an acknowledgement that we have to help construct democratic institutions, and that's not something easy. But that's the second phase of what we have to do before we do things and stand up for equal rights and human rights and minority rights. And then the third phase is economic development, because we need the democratic institutions in place to be able to absorb some of the aid that we're prepared to give them.
All right. And is that airstrikes with frontline states providing on-the-ground troops?
You mean American troops?
Not American troops, local troops from the frontline states?
Sure. Yes, absolutely.
All right.
They have to be able to provide on-the-ground intelligence about where to hit and how to avoid civilians.
All right. Okay. Well, Jim Arkedis, fellow at the Truman National Security Project, thanks for joining us. And obviously, we were kidding about the unfairness of my question, but it is a deadly serious situation, and we thank you for coming on the program and discussing it.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.